Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today for actually a very important event at Carnegie Middle East Center, the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. This is our first major report that has come out of our newly established political economy program that is being directed by my colleague Hamza Meddeb, who's with us here on the screen, and supported by my colleague also, Noor Arafeh. And this report actually is their brainchild. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to this discussion with us. And I want to thank both Amr and Manal also for joining. Amr took part in authoring some of the work around the report, and we will be talking about that in a short while as well. So first, let me welcome my colleagues around the screen. Noor Arafeh, fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, or the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center, research fellow. Hamza Meddeb, director of the Political Economy Program. Amr Adly, a colleague and a friend, professor at the American University in Cairo. And Manal, who is the professor at Oxford University, and also the director, Manal Shehabi, who's also the director of the Sheer Advisory, Research and Advisory. Thank you all for joining me today in this event. The report is basically looking at the triple crises that have hit many countries in the region, particularly the food, energy, and debt crisis. What we tried to focus on in this report is that this triple crisis has exacerbated structural and economic weaknesses of low and middle income countries, in particular Egypt, Tunis, and Lebanon. These are the three case studies in the report. It looks at how these crises have increased the pressure on domestic political orders, as incumbent regimes are currently facing acute policy dilemmas, since the restructuring of their economies could entail social and political costs that might ultimately undermine their authority. And this is true for all three countries. And we're seeing how the resistance to reform and to any kind of restructuring actually is manifesting itself across the political spectrum in each of these countries. But at the same time, these crises, this triple crisis that has hit those three countries, have also exacerbated the geopolitical marginalization of Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia, whilst bolstering the power of hydrocarbon exporters. So, Noor, let me begin with you first. You and Hamza examined the three crises, the food, debt, and energy, in the report. While these crises are often represented as contingent shocks, you argue that it's much more complex than that. Can you please elaborate a little bit about these crises and what they reveal?
Thank you, Maha, for hosting this webinar. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Manal, Amr, and Hamza. So, yeah, one of the main arguments we make in the report is that the food and debt crises, which were compounded by the impact of energy shocks on low and middle income countries in the MENA region, have been thrust into the spotlight because of events like the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. However, we argue that these crises are not merely the result of these external shocks like the pandemic and the war. Rather, we show that the crises are primarily structural in nature and are very much linked to inherent structural deficiencies in the economies of low and middle income countries in MENA, especially in Egypt, Tunisia, and Lebanon, which are the three countries we focus on in the report. So if we take the food crisis as an example, it has been largely associated with rising food prices, the decrease in the supply of certain foods because of supply chain disruptions, and restricted access to food, especially following the war in Ukraine. However, we show that the Ukraine conflict is only part of the story, and that the food crisis rather derives from a prolonged, enduring predicament that has engulfed the region's food systems, especially because of problems related to food production, the treatment of rural areas and workers, and the crisis in the environment. Similarly, when we examine the debt crisis, for example, our main argument is that the debt crises that countries such as Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia are facing are rooted in their political economy and in the model of economic development that each of these three countries has pursued. And this model has been characterized by underinvestment in productive sectors, the excessive growth of services, the promotion of speculative investments, especially in real estate, largely funded by debt financing, and the channeling of rent streams from society to a small group of well-connected elites. So, for example, if we focus on Egypt, where the debt ratio is more than 88% of GDP, we cannot understand the debt crisis without looking at the nature of Egypt's political economy, especially the development of a civilian military economy after Sisi came to power, and the more central role that has been given to the armed forces in the economy. And we highlight in the report, so I'm just giving one example. We highlight in the report that one of the main drivers of Egypt's debt crisis has been the unrestrained spending by the military on non-productive mega projects in the real estate sector that are led by military-owned firms, as well as expenditures on weapons by the government. And one of the main problems with these large-scale projects is that the Egyptian economy does not generate enough added value to offset the enormous capital investments that it has made. So these mega projects end up being funded mainly through debt financing, either domestic or foreign. So this, coupled with the state's over-reliance on short-term debt to finance its budget, has made the Egyptian economy increasingly vulnerable to external shocks, such as the global rise in interest rates. And then the war in Ukraine, the rise in Egypt's import bill, the decline in the country's foreign reserves, and the exchange rate devaluation, and the significant rise in debt servicing costs, all this led us to where we are now. We also show, again, I'm using the example of Egypt, how the structure of Egypt's economy has been another driver behind the debt crisis, specifically the lack of investment in productive and tradable sectors like manufacturing and agriculture. And this is something that Amr Adly talks about in his research. So Egypt has basically been unable to advance towards the production of more high value added goods and services that could ameliorate its balance of payments situation, either by increasing exports or decrease in import dependency. And so the consequence of all of this is that Egypt keeps facing the same financial problems time and time again. So this is in terms of the debt crisis. The last thing we focus on is when we examine the energy shock that hit MENA countries, specifically hydrocarbon importing countries with the war in Ukraine. We also show how the energy shock revealed significant vulnerabilities in these countries. It first highlighted the pressure that higher oil and gas prices placed on costly energy subsidy regimes in the region, and it also revealed the limited progress that MENA countries have made in transitioning to renewable energy sources and diversifying their energy mix, resulting in high levels of dependency on hydrocarbons. So basically, in the report, we argue that it is only by addressing these structural weaknesses that each of these countries can overcome the different economic crises it's facing.
Thanks, Noor. Thank you for this comprehensive overview, at least, of the report and the issues that it's tackling. Hamza, let me turn to you now, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the political and geopolitical ramifications of this triple crisis in these countries. How does it interact with, I mean, how do they interact with geopolitics and with geoeconomics in a certain way?
Thank you, Maha. I'm happy to join Amr, Manal, and Noor, and you, of course, for this panel. Well, actually, as following what was said and analyzed by Noor, actually, and these three shocks, actually, they are, putting the elite in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in Lebanon under pressure. It's clear that large fiscal deficits, high levels of spending, tight fiscal spaces, or almost inexistent fiscal spaces in countries like Egypt and Tunisia. And of course, Lebanon is in a dire situation since its default in 2019. Actually, the situation in these countries are really disastrous and putting pressure on elites to implement reforms. But the problem now is that reforms will come with political and social costs in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in Lebanon, of course. And these social and political costs, actually, they push actually elites in a way to manage carefully this reform process. So they are trying to dilute it, trying to divert it in a way, because simply they have really to pay attention and to be cautious, since these reforms, they are not only political, economic or technical, but they will profoundly shape and reshape the ruling coalitions and the state-society relations. If we take the case of Egypt, for example, it's clear that one of the key reforms that needs to be implemented in Egypt is reconsidering the role of the military in the economy. This is one of the key pillars of the IMF reform program that has been agreed between Egypt and the IMF, and this is one of the requirements or conditions also asked by the Gulf countries and the international community to secure financial assistance to Egypt. But of course, implementing or reconsidering or revising the role of the military is really a tricky issue in Egypt, in a sense that it will come for sure with, it will require a sort of, playing between factions, finding a consensus, which is really not easy actually to elaborate or to find. In the case of Tunisia, there is, any program of reform will imply forcibly revising the subsidy regime, reforming the subsidy regime, privatizing the part of the SOEs that are losing money actually, and most of them, all of them are losing money, and of course reducing the wage pay, and of course these three key reforms that are really asked by all funders in a way that are indispensable to secure any external financial assistance are extremely difficult to implement from a political and social perspective. Simply because, for a populist regime, this is difficult. Difficult to antagonize the labor union, the business union, but also difficult to increase prices and to cut funding and during a process of authoritarian restitution where the whole political system is being rebuilt. And while the new political leadership is really struggling to secure popularity and to secure mobilization of the society. And of course, in Lebanon, as you know, the situation needs any reform in Lebanon needs a compromise, between the factions and the sectarian elites, needs a deep financial reform, an agreement on the distribution of losses in a country where, distributing losses is more like is perceived, at least by the players, as a sort of, political capitulation. I mean, the sense of compromise is really lacking today on the political side, but also on the financial and economic side. So all these reforms are really putting pressure on elites who are really in the three countries, and elites are, for now at least, they are really preferring, or they have a preference for the short-term solutions and the sort of management of the status quo, rather than really embarking into a reform process that might be really highly risky. Of course, now, on the geopolitical side, I mean, I would say that the geopolitics is really the consequence of this incapacities of elites to address and to tackle this reform agenda and to implement this reform agenda. The three countries have been marginalized. They are really in dire need, desperate need of external financing assistance. And in the case of Tunisia, Egypt, and Lebanon, they are looking for a bailout from the Gulf, from the IMF, or from the European, or the G7, etc. And all these actually partners they are putting their requirements and conditions, of course, on the table. So simply, it's really without an IMF program in Tunisia, which is the case in Tunisia, and without really securing and giving guarantees that the IMF program in the case of Egypt will be implemented and will be progressing in the convened, or at least according to the convened agenda, and without a compromise in Lebanon, the situation and this blockage, this stalemate, has been in a way encouraging the partners either in the Gulf or in the West to refrain, actually, and to opt for a sort of a cautious attitude vis-à-vis Egypt, Tunisia, and Lebanon, playing the wait-and-see card, hedging their bets, but not really putting money on the table, bailing out these countries who are in an extreme need for financial assistance.
Well, I think bailout of these countries is going to be incredibly difficult if there are no serious political reforms, and this is what many of these, all potential funders, including the IMF, and I know for Lebanon, an IMF deal would unlock significant funding from other places. It's not just about the IMF, but the reforms needed have been rejected by the political elite. And for the most part, what I see in the three countries, I assume, is more of a short-termism, looking really at the short term, trying to survive politically because these reforms will undermine them. And the hope that, I don't know, some miracle will happen down the road where they will have to avoid the cost of bad policies, to say the least, over the past few decades. Manal, let me turn to you now and ask you about the energy crisis specifically, which has exacerbated the divides between oil exporting and oil importing countries. While oil exporting countries benefited, the latter, oil importing, had to cope with a higher burden, especially after the Ukraine crisis and the hike in energy prices. But all these countries are facing different challenges in any case. Can you please elaborate maybe a little bit more on the challenges faced by those different categories of countries, the uncertainty in the energy market, reforming subsidies, etc., and what this means for our region?
Thank you very much, Maha. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to join Noor, Amr, and Hamza. I think maybe to answer your question, maybe I'll start with maybe building on some of the stuff that Noor especially said at the very beginning, particularly in terms of, obviously we have, obviously countries are very different, but it's an easy way to group them between exporters and importers. And I think one of what has been kind of, we've been hearing from the two previous interventions, and back to your point as well, is a lot of these things that are challenges now are actually more structural and things that have really evolved over the years from economic and energy structures that have persisted. Obviously, oil exporters, even though they are still, some are rich, like those in the Gulf states, and then you have more challenged economically, whether it's Iraq or Libya, for example. I think maybe if we can look generally, yes, indeed, they have benefited from the rise of hydrocarbon or oil price in the energy crisis, and therefore higher export revenue. But a lot of their structural, Noor called it structural weaknesses. I would maybe call it structural rigidities instead of weaknesses. The rigidities in their economic structures have existed really for a long time. And that really had put a challenge in their efforts to trying to diversify economies away from hydrocarbons, which has been, a planned target that they've had for a long time. Because it's not only the dependence on hydrocarbons and consumption and in government revenue and in exports that is a major challenge, but also there is very large public sectors, for example, and the rigid wage bill is also large and has been funded by oil and gas export revenue. We also have historically have had very high subsidies, which have, a lot of them have obviously been reformed, and electricity have been cut throughout the Gulf exporters, particularly after the oil price collapsed in 2014, mid-2014. But even with that, we still have now approximately about 5% of their GDPs of the GCC only in subsidies, which is a large amount, of course. And then maybe another one of the rigidities is reliance on foreign labor, with a really large and growing young population that is now entering the labor market and soon needs more job opportunities that are ideally diversified and not hydrocarbon dependent. And then I would also say there's also a rigidity structurally from a very oligopolistic private sector, while in the oil sector, the public sector has dominated throughout lots of, basically, generally has been really the dominant player. So with the efforts to try to diversify their economies away from hydrocarbons, really the stresses have been very, perhaps the challenges have been revealed after the 2014 collapse, and then also of the oil price, and then obviously the COVID pandemic. But the recent energy crisis kind of gave a little bit of space, so to speak. So there's been a lot of influx of funds to fund energy transition plans, whether it's renewables, which remain, in my opinion, very slow compared to the targeted ambition plans that the countries have. But also things like exporting of green hydrogen projects and other energy transitions projects that are dependent very much on technology that currently is not necessarily available at scale and at the price that is needed. So the challenge, even though there's more funds to fund energy and economic diversification plans, the existing rigidities and the structure of the market really have, I think, delayed some of the advancements on the diversification and energy diversification fronts as well. If we compare that to oil importers, again, there are various differences across different countries of the region, but generally, they also have been impacted, of course, as we've heard earlier, by the effects of the rise of energy prices on food prices. But also there is another layer as well, because we can't forget that a lot of these countries also are dependent on foreign remittances from labor that are working in Gulf states. So when the Gulf states are doing better because of influx of more export revenue, then there's more remittances that are also going to importing economies, which in a way, not sufficiently, but also helps basically people on the ground who are really suffering from the extent of prices rising and inflation as well. But also the overall government's energy bills have also been increased, and the geopolitical situation in the cases, for example, of Jordan with the situation with Israel also posed another challenge of securing energy sources. So that gave more of an opportunity for oil importing states to expedite their transition, or their transition really in renewables away from their dependence on imported hydrocarbons. But for that, they need a lot of funds. So you have really a challenge of reducing, in one way, dependence on foreign imports from hydrocarbons, but at the same time, a large bill to fund these transition plans. So from a fiscal perspective, also oil importers are also strained, and without additional funds, they're really going to be very difficult for them to meet both the socioeconomic development needs, continue to reduce subsidies, or even in some instances where there's no subsidies, really help the socioeconomic impact of the population, while at the same time extending their transition in energy to reduce dependence on imported hydrocarbons.
Would this be the same for Gulf countries and, let's say, a country like Algeria, or are we talking about different things when we're talking about energy exporting countries?
That's a great question, and that's why at the beginning I said we do have to know that there are slight challenges. I think in terms of the problems that result from dependence predominantly on oil and gas exports are really common across all exporting economies, but the challenge is in how diversified their economies would be, and then also the extent of their energy transition plans. So when I was talking about the massive energy transition plans and the visions of diversification, that's a lot more in the situation of the Gulf states. Algeria also still needs to address a lot of the same issues, but also Algeria has higher populations and doesn't have the same visions of massive, let's say, energy transition plans at the same level as we know announced of the Gulf states. But a lot of the issues and the need for economic diversification are obviously across the region as a whole.
In any case,
and
we're
it's
going
a
to be
political structure and dependence on foreign labor that's also maybe a bit different in both states as well, in a marked way, of course.
No, absolutely, Manal. Anyway, our next report coming up, the next project we have is actually to focus a bit on the Gulf countries, the energy transition, but also the link to post-frontier approach or social contract, the changes in the social contract. But that's coming up in another year, hopefully. Amr, let me turn to you. Amr, you wrote an article with Hamza in preparation for this report on the marginalization or peripheralization of Egypt and Tunisia. So if we focus on the case of Egypt in particular, is this marginalization something new? Or is it rather, as I think you argue, a long-term process that only got exacerbated by the different crises? Perhaps you can walk us through some of this, please?
Thanks, Maha. Thanks a lot for having me. It's always a pleasure. So you are referring to the piece that I wrote with Hamza some months ago that compared, or not actually compared, tried to extend pretty much the same pattern that was unfolding for Egypt to that of Tunisia, as well as oil importing countries that have been running huge external imbalances that basically went out of control in the past 10 to 15 years in a way that exacerbated their dependency on various political mechanisms for bailout, for relief, for just like to keep them going. And in the case of Egypt, of course, this is a process that we could sense as starting as early as 2012 or 2013, especially with the oil-rich nations that were not always in the same camp, by the way. On many occasions, they were either competing with each other or at least they were not coordinating, which is the case. But to cut a long story short, Egypt's financial imbalances have basically undermined the relative and still threaten to undermine the relative autonomy that it has often enjoyed, despite always showing some element of dependency, be it on the Gulf or be it on the IMF or be it on some bilateral or multilateral form of financing. Our assessment back in the paper is that this was simply becoming untenable, especially that in one of the, I wouldn't say rare occasions, but not very often happening, you have the GCC countries pretty much bringing in the IMF in order to mediate between any potential bailout to Egypt, and like the country's ruling regime, which is very strange because like it's not exactly surprising, but it like Egypt used to use them as substitutes to a great extent, capitalizing on its geopolitical weight to draw different forms of rent. These rents, of course, have dried up. They have ceased to take the form of rent in the sense of like a free lunch. So starting from short-term debt that has to be basically paid back in the form of deposits from central banks from the GCC countries, for instance, to bringing in the IMF to make sure that the macro economy and other structural issues, not structural issues a la Noor's presentation, but rather structural issues very much along the neoclassical economic lines of introducing further rounds of austerity, like basically providing better conditions for those who will invest in the country, but as a matter of fact, invest in the country's debt rather than invest in the economy itself, which is something that is very problematic and something that also requires us to be rather cautious and critical when it comes to the list of recommendations and the kind of analysis that we usually get from the IMF, that the problem is that the government is too big, the problem is that the expenditures, etc. Because eventually Egypt did much of its homework after 2016, yet we are pretty much in a worse situation even when we started. We need another bailout from the Gulf, but this time the Gulf is bringing in the IMF, and this time the bailout is not going to take the form of fresh money being injected into the economy, but rather what seems to be a negotiated large-scale transfer of assets at a very cheap price, given the deterioration in the Egyptian pound. So overall, we could see that there is an unmistakable economic peripheralization that is happening to Egypt, because even though the country was never a stranger to inflows of money from abroad, this is something that is becoming like there is the need is becoming more dire, and the need is becoming even more frequent. So you need bigger amounts of money at shorter periods of time to get into the economy in order to enable the economy to move ahead. So I don't see yet the political outcome of such economic peripheralization being dramatically manifested, but I know that we will get into discussing the events in or like the Israeli aggression on Gaza, and maybe then we can like try to situate this argument vis-a-vis the ongoing crisis in the region.
No, we will certainly come back to that, Amr, particularly because I mean, prior to the Gaza crisis or to the Gaza conflict, we already were looking at a situation where the debt had become unsustainable in Egypt. And there didn't seem to be a way out, at least based on all the indicators we had at the time. Social unrest was increasing, economic frustration was increasing amongst the population, and no clear political vision for a way out. So it's this kind of a conundrum. There was an expectation that things would get much more difficult this year. Now, with the Gaza conflict in play, I don't know whether this has changed. This kind of calculus has changed or not. We'll come back to it shortly. Let me turn to Noor again, just so we continue focusing at least on the report, and then we can end up on this question. Noor, let me come back to you. If you can talk a little bit about, we've heard about the energy crisis, we've heard a bit about the debt crisis in Egypt particularly. You focused a lot on the food crisis, and a big section of the report is actually focused on the food crisis. And conversations that you and I had were talking about the food crisis as not an issue of prices and affordability, but actually as an issue of long-term structural challenges within the production systems, food production systems. and that it's a lot more complex than what it is often depicted to be. Can you perhaps walk us through some of this argument around food, especially at the time when we're seeing how much, we are hearing figures about the number of people who are hungry in the region, not just in conflict-ridden countries, but just across the region. Poverty levels are going up, as is inequality, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah, Maha. So basically, to understand the food crisis in a solid way, we actually focus on the food systems or the food regimes in Lebanon, Tunisia, and Egypt. And our main argument, which draws on an article that Maysoon Sukkariya at King's College London and I co-authored, which was specifically focused on Lebanon, our argument is that the current food crisis is actually the product of 4 structurally embedded and interlinked problems that have afflicted the food systems in the MENA region. We're focusing specifically on low and middle income countries, Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia. So the first problem, which you alluded to just now, is food insecurity, which has grown in the past decade. In 2021, even before the war in Ukraine, more than 1/3 of the MENA region's population was moderately or severely food insecure with no regular access to food. With the COVID-19 pandemic and the supply chain disruptions, food insecurity levels kept increasing. And the situation was then further exacerbated by the start of the conflict in Ukraine in February 2022, given the high levels of import dependency by MENA countries. Specifically on Ukraine and Russia. So basically, the region is the world's largest grain importer, and half of its imports of wheat, which is the main ingredient of the food basket in MENA region, half of the imports of wheat come from Russia and Ukraine. So countries, especially low and middle income countries in the region, have been very vulnerable to the consequences of the war, which disrupted food supplies and pushed up prices of food, fertilizer, and energy, which in turn increased the import bills of these countries and negatively affected their trade balances and their foreign exchange situation. So the food crisis was basically exacerbated, and it also exacerbated the ongoing debt crisis that countries were going through. So we show in the report how all this led to a decline in consumer purchasing power, restricting access to food, and increasing food insecurity. But this is only one aspect of the food crisis. Another important structural deficiency that is that we should focus on to understand the current food crisis is the shift in food regimes to import dependency and the ensuing problem of domestic agricultural production, especially the decline in production to meet local demand. So specifically, we argue that the economic liberalization policies that were adopted since the 1970s by MENA countries and the incorporation of local agricultural systems into the global economy, this motivated states to push for capital-intensive, export-oriented agricultural products that could bring in hard currency. So what we're saying is that export agriculture and the large-scale cultivation of cash crops became favored in many countries over the development of agriculture to meet local demands or for local food consumption. So the ability of a country like Egypt, which became an agricultural exporter to feed its own population, was greatly undermined during this process. And of course, the promotion of export agriculture has coincided with increasing levels of dependency on food imports. And this heavy reliance on food imports has, of course, contributed directly to food insecurity and to the current food crisis in the MENA region, because it increased the country's vulnerability to both domestic shocks and external shocks like the war in Ukraine, supply chain disruptions, and price fluctuations. The third problem afflicting the food system, the food systems of these countries is the inequality that rural areas and small farmers face. And we basically argue that the urban bias of most policymakers, their neglect of the agricultural sector and rural areas, have heavily affected domestic agricultural production and also contributed to food insecurity. We also show how the displacement and devaluation of agricultural labor, especially small-scale farmers, is also an important factor that should be taken into account to understand the current food crisis. For example, the limited access by farmers in Tunisia to land and credit, the modes of land ownership and land distribution in countries like Lebanon and Egypt led to the marginalization of small farmers and to their displacement. And this resulted in labor shortages in the agricultural sector, which negatively affected domestic agricultural production and also led to loss of indigenous knowledge when it comes to sustainable food production practices. The fourth key aspect of the food crisis, and I will end here, is the water and environmental crisis. So basically, we cannot understand the food crisis without linking it to what's happening in terms of climate change, but also the water crisis. And the main point is that the large-scale, capital-intensive nature of production that was adopted by countries like Lebanon, Egypt, and Tunisia with the focus on export agriculture, this has led to a crisis of environmental sustainability, especially relating to unsustainable food production practices. So, for example, we know about the heavy use of agrochemicals in many countries, which are used to maximize crop yields and maximize profits. This has undermined land productivity, has caused soil salinization, and led to environmental damage because chemicals basically leach into and they contaminate the soil, negatively affecting agricultural productivity. Another key problem we highlight is related to, as I mentioned earlier, the growing deficit and contamination of water resources in the region. And this is like a topic on its own because it's a very critical problem facing MENA countries. So overall, we argue that we cannot find a solution to the food crisis without taking into account these four key problems that are afflicting the food system in the region.
Thank you, Noor. Absolutely. I think there's not much one can argue with that. Hamza, let me turn to you. Sorry, Manal, before I turn to Hamza. Manal, let me turn to you because you talked about the need for both, both exporting and importing energy, exporting and energy importing countries, their need to adjust to the incoming energy transition. Actually, it's not coming, it's already started to some extent. Many have been struggling to foster renewable and energy production and adjust energy crises. And some, like Lebanon, for example, have turned to renewable energy sources because of the crises in the country, but with very little oversight or any kind of forward planning. So we saw people, installing solar panels, etc., turning to a lot of renewable energy sources, but with very little kind of long-term planning, whether in terms of what kind of grid is needed, what do you do with the batteries, etc. I mean, it raised a lot of questions. So can you talk to us a little bit of what needs to be done for the energy transition, in particular for those three countries, but also for Gulf countries? What needs to be in place?
I think in the context of the energy transitions, we need to first separate that there is maybe the global energy transition outside the region where, there is a big push, and as you mentioned, it's already underway, to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. And that by itself has significant negative impacts on the region that depends on, particularly, obviously, oil and gas exporters that depend on energy in their economies, and also has ripple effects on the other countries. But then there's also the struggle, as you mentioned, of what the region is trying to do for energy transitions within the region. Maybe before I answer your question, maybe just kind of give a brief overview where we are, the state of energy transitions in the regions. And this is an area where, even though oil and gas economies, or exporters, I should say, have a more larger fiscal spaces from the export revenue, it is actually the oil importers that are indeed way ahead in their renewable energy penetration than oil exporters. So to give you an example, oil exporters, maybe with the exception, well, the GCC and Iraq, for example, with the exception of the UAE, less than 1% of electricity is generated from renewables. But if you go to Egypt, it's in their 20%, I think, Morocco 34%, Jordan about 24%, and about 13% or so in Tunisia. And part of the reason for this discrepancy is because it's energy security. I think I mentioned that earlier. It's energy security motivations and reducing the import bill of energy at a fiscal space, at a government level, that had really driven these advancements in oil importers. In oil exporters, however, it's been delayed because I think the economic motivation for a long time wasn't really there. And I actually wrote a piece particularly on the hurdles of energy transition in the GCC states that was published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So your opposite, I guess, or your counterpart in the States. And in that, I list specifically that part of the reason for the delay is that energy transitions in the region have really been an economic response. And then when we saw the acceleration of that in terms of in large plans and net zero emission targets, et cetera, was really to generate additional export revenue to the state and really maintain the role of the state, and of course fund economic development, but really maintain the role of the state and the existing political equilibrium, or what you called earlier social contract, that already has been in place. So a lot of while we have these two transitions, there is still a focus in oil exporters, not so much on going away from fossil fuels, but on transitioning while keeping fossil fuels in the mix. And that largely depends on technology, carbon capture technologies that is either very expensive or we don't really have it at the moment. So that is part of, I think, of the delay. And in terms of, but then of course there's the other issue that requires significant changes at a grid level, for example. It requires changes at a regulatory infrastructure. We also have an oligopolistic private sector, as I mentioned, where they're basically have small role in the energy sector as opposed to a larger role, for example, in places like Morocco or Jordan. Well, the private sector led a lot of the renewable energy expansion. So that kind of explains a lot of the differences. And then I want to get to, I think, the important part of your question about the impact on the development issues. The situation that you mentioned in Lebanon is very different, because I think the failure of the state to provide energy transitions has really kind of allowed people to find solutions, while in other parts of the region, it's really the state that's leading that. And I think without those solutions at a long-term, but also at a structural level for the whole system, it's not going to be sustainable necessarily. And I'm just mindful of time. I'll just end with the fact that I think one of the big problems of how it will impact development and economic diversification is, if it's implemented, it could contribute to economic diversification across the region. But at the same time, it really needs significant funds, and those funds are basically have other competing urgent priority needs for development, particularly in importing economies.
Thank you, Manal. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. Hamza, let me turn to you now, and let's go to to Tunisia, where we see the current populist regime facing all the economic challenges, basically the economic challenges that were faced by the elites of the country in previous years, in terms of implementing economic reforms, servicing debt, creating jobs, and meeting the aspirations of the population. So these are historic challenges which a populist regime right now is trying to address them at a time when its fiscal space has shrunk even more than what it was in 2011. So if you can talk to us a little bit about how Kais Saied, Tunisia's president, is trying to address these different challenges without losing even further any kind of support that he continues to have in the country.
Yeah, thank you, Maha. I prefer to leave Egypt to Amr, I'm
Yeah,
more
no, I will.
comfortable.
I'm coming back to Egypt with Amr.
Sure, sure. No, actually, I think that Tunisia is offering, an interesting experience. After a decade of democratization, that was quite interesting to look at closely. From either practitioner or scholars or analysts. To see how a democratization process in our region can go through ups and downs, etc., and can backslide and even can simply collapse. Actually, that's what we saw in July 21 after the power grab of Said. I think Tunisia is offering another quite interesting experience, which is a populist experience managing economic economic constraints, I would say, or under deep economic and fiscal constraints. Tunisia, it's not a country that is, endowed with natural resources, so we cannot see, a sort of petro-populism, what was the case in Libya under Gaddafi, for example, or in Latin America, etc. So I think here another specificity or particularity of Tunisia is to see this economic adjustment operated by populism. And I would say that what Said is doing is really an adjustment without reform. So I disagree very much with those who say that okay, Said is doing nothing in a way, neither adjustment nor reform. And I think he's adjusting the economy, but without reforming it. And I will try to explain. I think that Said is operating on three levels. He is, instead of reforming the subsidy regime, in terms of adjusting prices, etc., he's cutting imports. And this explains the frequent shortages that the country is going through, actually. There is a really sort of an engineering of shortages in the country, a deep and very refined way to organize and to manage shortages of fuel, shortages of basic food products, of electricity, of water, etc. And I think here this is quite interesting because the adjustment is not operated through prices but through quantity, through reducing the import through administrative barriers, restrictions, etc. Said is reducing the trade deficit and is reducing the need for foreign currency in a way, dedicating the bulk of the reserves and the bulk of the foreign currency to servicing the debt, not to covering the import needs. This is one level where how Said operates in a way. The second level, I think, which is quite interesting, is a massive reliance now on the domestic debt. So what Said is doing is relying increasingly on domestic debt. The Tunisia's debt used to be the external debt. Used to be, the Tunisia's debt used to be mainly, or Tunisia used to rely on debt by, held by the multilaterals, bilateral bonds, etc. Now what we are seeing is increasingly the proportion of the domestic debt in comparison to the external debt is increasing in a way. We are at 60% of external debt and 40% of domestic debt, which is quite interesting because this over-reliance on domestic debt is producing an interesting dynamic, a negative dynamic, by the way, which is crowding out effect on the private sector, on the funding that could be eventually allocated to the private sector. And this is coming with a cost, which is really killing almost the growth. And this explains the low growth rate and the incapacity of Tunisia actually to recover after the several shocks of the COVID, of the war in Ukraine, etc. I mean, this is quite interesting. Simply here, we see that it's a populism that is keep prioritizing the service of the debt, that doesn't want to, unlike maybe what many analysts, etc., predicted, that Said would default on the debt, would choose to go and to default on the debt. Actually, no. He keeps servicing the debt, but through an excessive reliance on domestic debt. The other tool or instruments of adjustment is, in a way, the scapegoating technique. So what is quite interesting here is that Said is operating, or starts to operate, a sort of economic purge among the business elite, but without really reforming the rules of the game, without really reforming the regulation of the economy. We know that for decades, the Tunisia's economy has been based on a sort of discretionary way to distribute or to allocate resources, credit, access to licenses, to banking funding, etc., etc. What Said could have done is really to reform the rules of the game in the Tunisia's economy. But this is not how he's operating. He's targeting businessmen, wealthy businessmen, which is quite interesting. This is new in Tunisia, but without really reforming the rules of the game, without reforming the regulation mechanisms of the economy. So what probably will be, he will be operating a sort of replacing probably these business elites with a new elite that is closing or creating his own cronies. I think this is most probably his plan, but not really reforming and restructuring the economy. So what is really quite interesting in the case, again, with the case of populism in our region, is it's very much operating a sort of adjustment without reforming, and instead of restructuring, he's buying time, actually, playing the card of delaying, managing status quo, scapegoating, creating, enemies, targeting, speculators, political elites, economic elites, but not really transforming the economy. While, he has the capacity, at least theoretically, since he's using or claiming to be popular and to have this capacity to mobilize the society. But I think Said knows profoundly that he's lacking, in a way, popularity. And what we are seeing here in Tunisia is there is a popularity gap for Said. He's a populist without massive support from the population. That's why he's operating this kind of adjustment without preferring going through a true and genuine reform process.
Thank you, Hamza. So it's populism, but no policies. Amr, let me turn to you for the final question, which, as we talked earlier, is coming back to Gaza. According to some analysts, the current war on Gaza could be an opportunity for Egypt, in the sense that no one will let Egypt collapse financially. For example, the IMF announced the extension of its program. The EU announced an investment package. So is geopolitics coming to the rescue of Egypt, given the situation in Gaza? And will this create a moral hazard again and push the regime to keep the status quo and kind of continue to avoid painful but incredibly important reforms for the future of the country?
Well, that's a very good question, Maha. I'm not sure
whether
a
difficult one, I know.
It is, yes, exactly. Because I even though geopolitics has come to the rescue many times, I would say, in Egypt's contemporary history, I think that it's not a unique case. We can talk about a number of cases, especially that you have what Manal has alluded to, pretty much huge inflows, cyclical ones, of oil and fossil fuel related rent, then one that is redistributed through a variety of political and political economic, but hardly merely market-driven mechanisms of distribution. These are usually political acts of redistribution. So this is pretty much there. And one of the interesting issues here is that Egypt has been in this situation. I mean, like a dire situation that started as early as February or March 2022. That is almost 2 years ago. And I mean, like the crisis has deteriorated, like has been exacerbated, has worsened, but not to the extent really of stopping the economy or pushing the country to financial meltdown. And that itself, you end up eventually not knowing exactly why have things deteriorated. Just to stop there, I think there is a geopolitical factor that is already there. It seems that Egypt's different allies have already shown interest in like avoiding a collapse of the economy, but they are not so willing to allow or to finance a recovery without changing pretty much many rules of the game. And this has been the main like bone of contention ever since. The idea of the terms according to which a recovery could be financed. I think that there is an overall agreement that things should not be allowed to deteriorate in a way that would impact negatively socio-political stability. And that's why the GCC countries that we have been complaining a lot about have actually rebuilt Egypt's almost completely depleted reserves a couple of years ago. They did like finance the rebuilding. Nowadays, almost 90% of foreign reserves in Egypt are made up of short-term and medium-term deposits owned by central banks in the GCC countries. This time Qatar is included as well. So I think that they have shown this basic level of commitment. Nowadays, you are having this commitment also being renewed by the Europeans and the Americans in the wake of the, I wouldn't say also only the crisis in Gaza, because I think that the war in Gaza has already transformed itself into a region-wide, so far low-intensity crisis. But you are already having this issue in Yemen, in southern Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran. Like it's sort of like the Americans have not managed to contain the thing. And now it's either the war ends in Gaza or the like things deteriorate further in the region as a whole. So all of this makes it imperative to again take a look at what should be done in order to allow further instability by yet another crisis in Egypt. But that gets us
to you mean to prevent further instability?
Exactly. And that's already playing. Like you have Blinken coming in with the Secretary of Treasury, the IMF talking about doubling the amount of money that they would lend to Egypt. Of course, still doubling, like raises questions about whether this is enough or not, because it gets you back to the political dynamic of redistributing rent, because all of this is about the creation of the macroeconomic conditions that would be satisfying enough for different GCC investors, private as well as sovereign, to inject money into the country. And that itself has become tied, I think, one way or another to the terms of reconstruction of Gaza after the war. That will weigh a lot on the rearrangement politically. So that would provide, yes, more room for an Egyptian role, but also would put pressure on what Egypt could do and for who exactly.
Thank you so much, Amr. There has been concern that accepting some Palestinians from Gaza might be one part of the price that Egypt will be asked to pay. We hope that it will not come to that for a host of reasons that I think we've come to the end of our event, so we will not be getting into, at least not in this forum, but there will be other chances to discuss this. I want to thank you, Manal, Amr, Noor, and Hamza for this very fascinating, very interesting discussion, and Noor and Hamza for a fabulous report. I encourage everybody to go and read it and look at the recommendations included in it. Thank you again. Until the next time. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.